Power is almost never what it looks like from the outside. What if the real force driving Macbeth was never ambition, but fear wearing the mask of ambition so convincingly that even he couldn't tell the difference? Because here's the unsettling question underneath everything: when someone reaches for control, are they reaching for greatness, or are they trying to silence something inside themselves that refuses to stay quiet? In the world of Macbeth, nothing begins with violence. It begins with interpretation. A moment is heard, a meaning is assigned, and suddenly the mind starts building a future around a possibility that hasn't happened yet. A future that feels less like destiny and more like protection. And this is where the first fracture appears. We often assume power is about expansion, growth, dominion. But Macbeth reveals something far more uncomfortable: power can also be defensive. A psychological shield constructed not to conquer the world, but to keep the world from becoming unpredictable. That's the first memory fragment. A man does not always climb toward a throne because he wants it. Sometimes he climbs because standing still feels more dangerous than moving forward. And once that idea takes hold, every decision changes shape. Because now every delay feels like vulnerability. Every hesitation feels like exposure. Every unknown becomes a threat that must be eliminated before it has the chance to define you. But here's the contradiction that starts to consume everything. The more Macbeth tries to eliminate uncertainty, the more uncertain he becomes. And this is not just a political collapse. It's a psychological loop. A system where fear does not decrease with control, it multiplies through it. So the question shifts. Is Macbeth actually gaining power? Or is he trying to outrun a feeling that keeps evolving faster than his ability to suppress it? Because fear doesn't behave like an enemy you defeat once. It behaves like a signal. And when that signal is ignored, it grows louder. Not outside, but inside. There's a second memory fragment hidden in this structure. Every attempt to secure absolute safety produces the opposite result: heightened sensitivity to threat. The mind starts scanning for danger everywhere, even in silence. And this is where the scale shifts. What begins as a personal insecurity becomes a governing logic. A way of seeing the world. A lens where every relationship, every silence, every possibility becomes something that must be controlled before it becomes dangerous. At that point, power is no longer a destination. It becomes a dependency. And dependencies always demand more. But here's the question that refuses to settle. If power is being used as protection, what happens when protection itself becomes the source of fear? Because that's the paradox Macbeth begins to embody. The system designed to eliminate anxiety becomes the very system that produces it. And once that loop begins, there is no external enemy left that matters more than the internal one. So we're left with a disturbing possibility. Maybe Macbeth is not a story about a man who wanted too much. Maybe it is a story about a man who could never feel safe enough, no matter what he achieved. And if that is true, then the question is no longer about Macbeth at all. It becomes something larger, heavier, and harder to escape. How many decisions in history, and in ordinary life, are not driven by desire for power, but by the quiet fear of what happens if we stop trying to control everything? The deeper you go into Macbeth's mindset, the more one question starts to dominate everything else. If fear is driving his decisions, then what exactly is he trying to protect, and why does that protection never feel complete? Because something subtle shifts once power enters the equation. It stops being a goal and starts behaving like a diagnostic tool. Every moment of uncertainty becomes evidence. Every silence becomes a signal. Every possibility becomes a threat that must be neutralized before it becomes real. And this is where the core conflict stops being political and becomes psychological. Macbeth is no longer reacting to the world as it is. He is reacting to the world as it might become. And that distinction changes everything. Contextually, this is where most systems of authority fail, not through external opposition, but through internal escalation. A mind built around eliminating risk eventually starts generating risk everywhere it looks. Not because danger increases, but because perception becomes saturated with it. There is a memory fragment hidden in this pattern. A ruler does not fall when enemies grow stronger, but when uncertainty becomes intolerable. So the question becomes sharper. Is Macbeth actually making rational choices inside a dangerous world, or is he constructing danger as a way to justify the choices he already feels compelled to make? That contradiction begins to fracture the entire structure. Because if power is supposed to stabilize fear, then why does every step forward amplify it instead? This is where the second layer of insight emerges. Power, in Macbeth's psychological system, is not control over others, it is an attempt to stabilize the self. A kind of emotional architecture built to prevent collapse from within. But the paradox is brutal. The more structure he builds externally, the less stable he becomes internally. And once that loop starts, it becomes self-reinforcing. A second memory fragment appears here. Insecurity does not disappear when it is acted upon, it adapts. It evolves into vigilance, then into suspicion, then into interpretation of everything as potential threat. At this point, reality is no longer experienced directly. It is filtered through a system of defensive meaning-making. And this is where the scale shifts again. What begins as one man's psychological instability begins to resemble a governance model. Decisions are no longer isolated actions, they become reflections of a worldview where uncertainty is the only true enemy. But here's the contradiction that destabilizes everything. The more aggressively uncertainty is eliminated, the more powerful uncertainty becomes as a concept. Because you cannot destroy ambiguity, you can only redistribute it. And that redistribution always returns inward. So Macbeth's trajectory is not simply about ambition intensifying. It is about perception collapsing into itself. A closed loop where every attempt to secure the external world feeds instability in the internal one. And now a deeper revelation begins to surface. What if the real driver was never ambition at all, but a refusal to tolerate the feeling of not knowing what comes next? A refusal so strong that it begins to reshape reality into something that feels controllable, even if that control is an illusion. That possibility reframes everything. Because it suggests the tragedy is not about gaining power too quickly, but about using power as a substitute for emotional certainty. And substitutes always fail eventually. So we are left standing in a tightening corridor of logic. If fear creates the need for control, and control amplifies fear, then what system breaks first, the world outside Macbeth, or the internal structure of meaning he has built to survive it? And if that structure collapses not because of enemies, but because it was never designed to resolve fear in the first place, then what exactly was controlling him all along? The question now is no longer about what Macbeth did. It becomes something far more unstable. What force turns human decision-making into a loop where the attempt to feel safe is precisely what guarantees the loss of safety? The most unsettling shift is not when a person begins to fear the world, but when they begin to trust their fear more than the world itself. So the question now deepens: if every decision is being filtered through a need for psychological safety, then who is actually making the decisions, the conscious mind, or the fear trying to avoid its own collapse? At this stage, Macbeth's internal system is no longer reacting to isolated events. It is operating as a continuous interpretation engine. Every silence is read as concealment. Every delay becomes suspicion. Every uncertain signal becomes potential betrayal. And this is where the crisis becomes structural. Because a mind built to eliminate uncertainty eventually stops distinguishing between uncertainty and reality. The deeper context reveals something uncomfortable about power itself. Power does not eliminate fear. It reorganizes it. It gives fear new objects, new directions, new justifications. The more control is achieved externally, the more refined the internal threat detection becomes. There is a memory fragment embedded in this pattern. When a person begins to feel safest, they often become most sensitive to imagined threats. But here is where contradiction sharpens into instability. If power was supposed to stabilize perception, why does perception become more unstable the higher the power rises? That contradiction does not resolve. It escalates. Because now every action Macbeth takes to secure certainty produces the opposite effect. The system begins to self-amplify. Control creates vigilance. Vigilance creates suspicion. Suspicion creates more control. A loop that feeds itself without external input. And at the center of this loop is not ambition, but interpretation. What Macbeth is really trying to control is not territory or people. It is meaning. The meaning of events. The meaning of silence. The meaning of uncertainty itself. But meaning cannot be stabilized. It can only be rewritten endlessly. This is where escalation becomes unavoidable. A second memory fragment surfaces. Systems that rely on total interpretation eventually collapse under the weight of their own interpretations. And once that happens, power stops functioning as protection. It becomes a generator of anxiety. Now the perspective shifts outward. Because this is no longer just a personal psychological loop. It begins to resemble a governing logic. A structure where authority itself becomes dependent on continuous threat recognition. A system where stability requires the constant production of instability. And here is the critical revelation beginning to emerge. If a ruler cannot tolerate uncertainty, then uncertainty does not disappear. It is externalized, multiplied, and projected back into the world as something that must be controlled. But the world does not behave like a closed system. It reacts. It reflects. It resists interpretation. So every attempt to impose certainty creates more variables than it eliminates. And this is where the consequence becomes unavoidable. Macbeth's trajectory is not simply a descent into instability. It is the exposure of a deeper mechanism. The attempt to use control as a substitute for psychological safety guarantees the opposite result. It guarantees escalation, not resolution. The system does not fail because it is weak. It fails because it is over-optimized for fear. And now the scale shifts again, beyond the individual mind. If this loop exists inside one consciousness, could it also exist inside systems of authority, leadership, or entire structures of decision-making? Could fear, once embedded at the top, cascade downward as interpretation, suspicion, and over-control at every level? Because if that is true, then Macbeth is not an exception. He is a prototype. And that leads to a deeper, more unstable mystery forming beneath everything we have seen so far. If fear can build systems of power that unintentionally reinforce fear, then what exactly is steering the system, the intention of the individual, or the logic of the system itself once fear becomes its foundation? And if that logic is self-sustaining, then the most important question is no longer about Macbeth's choices at all. It becomes something far more disquieting. At what point does a system stop reflecting fear and start behaving as if fear is the only rational way to exist? At this point, the real question is no longer whether fear influences decision-making, but whether fear becomes the hidden architecture behind what we call rational choice in the first place. And the revelation is this. Fear is not an emotion in Macbeth's system. It is an organizing principle. It is the invisible structure that determines what becomes important, what becomes dangerous, and what must be eliminated before it has a chance to exist. What looks like ambition is actually fear translated into strategy. What looks like control is fear translated into action. What looks like destiny is fear translated into narrative. This is the moment everything reconfigures. Because once fear becomes a system of organization, it stops needing external triggers. It begins generating its own evidence. It starts interpreting silence as threat, possibility as risk, and uncertainty as urgency. A memory fragment emerges here. When fear becomes the lens, reality no longer appears as it is, but as it must be managed. And this reframes Macbeth completely. He is no longer simply responding to prophecy or opportunity. He is operating inside a psychological structure where every undefined space must be filled with control, because emptiness itself feels like danger. This is the deeper revelation. Macbeth is not chasing power to gain something. He is using power to erase the experience of vulnerability. But vulnerability cannot be erased. It only shifts shape. So the consequence is structural, not situational. Every increase in control increases the surface area of perceived threat. Every attempt to stabilize meaning creates more ambiguity that demands interpretation. The system begins to behave like a closed circuit where fear continuously re-enters itself in new forms. And here is where the scale shifts dramatically. This is no longer about one individual mind. This is about what happens when decision-making systems are built on the assumption that uncertainty is a problem to be eliminated rather than a condition to be understood. Because in such systems, certainty is never reached. It is only simulated. And simulation requires constant reinforcement. Another memory fragment surfaces. The illusion of control becomes most powerful precisely when control is least stable. So Macbeth's trajectory is not a deviation from rationality. It is a hyperlogical extension of a flawed premise that safety can be achieved by removing unpredictability from existence. But unpredictability is not external. It is structural. It is embedded in reality itself. And this creates the deepest consequence yet. If fear is organizing perception, and perception is driving action, then action is no longer responding to reality. It is responding to a constructed interpretation of reality that must constantly be updated to remain coherent. That means every decision becomes both solution and reinforcement of the original problem. And this is where legacy enters the system. Macbeth becomes more than a character experiencing collapse. He becomes a demonstration of how systems built on fear inevitably begin to produce the conditions they were designed to avoid. Because fear cannot distinguish between protection and escalation. It only knows intensity. And intensity, once normalized, becomes direction. Now the implication expands outward again. If this mechanism is true at the level of an individual, then it does not remain isolated. It scales. It replicates. It becomes embedded in leadership, institutions, and any structure that equates uncertainty with failure. And suddenly, fear is no longer personal. It is infrastructural. Which leads to the final unresolved rupture in understanding. If fear is not just influencing decisions, but defining the logic of how decisions are made, then what remains of choice itself? Is it still agency, or has it already become a reflection of an invisible system that treats uncertainty as the ultimate enemy? And if that system is self-reinforcing, the question is no longer about what Macbeth understood. It becomes something far more destabilizing. Can a mind, or even a civilization, recognize that it is not reacting to reality at all, but to the fear of reality becoming uncontrollable? The deepest question beneath everything is no longer about how fear influences power, but about why the human mind repeatedly transforms uncertainty into something that must be controlled, even when control consistently produces the very instability it is meant to eliminate. And the core revelation is this. Macbeth is not a tragedy of ambition. It is a tragedy of misdiagnosed fear. Fear, in its raw form, is not the enemy. It is a signal system designed to map uncertainty. But in Macbeth's structure, that signal is misread as a problem to be solved rather than a reality to be understood. And once that misinterpretation takes hold, every decision becomes an attempt to erase the signal instead of interpreting it correctly. That is the hidden architecture. A memory fragment emerges. When a warning is treated as an enemy, every attempt to silence it increases the urgency of the warning itself. This is the point where the entire psychological system locks into place. Macbeth does not gain power and then become afraid. He becomes afraid, and then builds power as a response that he believes will resolve that fear. But because the fear is not caused by external conditions alone, no external change can resolve it. So the system fails from the beginning. And this is the expansion that changes everything. Power, in this framework, is not a goal, but a compensatory mechanism. It functions like an emotional prosthetic, designed to replace internal stability with external control. But external control is always incomplete because reality contains variables that cannot be fully contained or predicted. Another memory fragment surfaces. The more precise the attempt to control uncertainty, the more sensitive the system becomes to anything that cannot be controlled. This creates the core paradox. Macbeth's rise is not a movement toward dominance. It is a movement deeper into dependency on control itself. And dependency always escalates. At first, control is selective. Then it becomes continuous. Then it becomes automatic. Then it becomes identity. And once control becomes identity, any loss of control feels like existential collapse. This is where the consequence expands beyond the individual. Because systems built on fear do not stabilize when they succeed. They intensify their own logic. They begin to interpret neutrality as threat, silence as resistance, and unpredictability as hostility. So the structure does not relax. It tightens. And that tightening becomes self-perpetuating. Now the scale shift is unavoidable. What appears in Macbeth as personal psychological distortion is actually a universal pattern. When uncertainty is treated as something to eliminate rather than something to navigate, the result is not safety but amplification of insecurity at every level of decision-making. This is why the tragedy feels larger than one man. It is not about a failure of character. It is about a failure of interpretation. A system error in how fear is processed. And here is the most important insight. Fear does not corrupt power. Fear defines the form power takes. So Macbeth is not someone who misuses authority. He is someone whose authority is shaped entirely by the need to neutralize internal instability that cannot be neutralized externally. A final memory fragment anchors this idea: systems built to eliminate discomfort eventually reorganize themselves around the continuous production of discomfort, because that is the only condition they understand how to respond to. Now everything converges. If fear is not just influencing Macbeth but structuring the way he understands reality, then every action he takes is both an attempt at resolution and a reinforcement of the original distortion. And that creates a closed loop with no natural exit. Because the system is not failing due to external opposition. It is failing due to internal design. So the philosophical weight becomes unavoidable. If the mind converts uncertainty into threat, and threat into control, and control back into deeper sensitivity to uncertainty, then what would it take to interrupt a loop that is self-justifying at every stage of its existence? And more unsettling than that. If this loop is not unique to one individual, but embedded in how power, decision-making, and ambition are psychologically structured, then what exactly are we calling stability in the first place, if not a carefully maintained illusion built on the management of fear? The consequence of this entire structure is not collapse in a dramatic sense, but something far more subtle and far more persistent: a world that continues functioning while quietly reorganizing itself around fear as its default operating logic. What remains after the turning point is not Macbeth as a person, but Macbeth as a pattern. Because once a mind learns to translate uncertainty into threat and threat into control, that pattern does not disappear with the individual. It persists as a template for interpretation. And here is the consequence that defines everything. Fear, when it becomes structural, stops needing awareness to operate. It begins to reproduce itself through decision-making that feels rational, even necessary. Each choice appears justified in isolation, but together they form a system that continuously narrows the space of possibility. A memory fragment returns here: a ruler does not need to believe in danger for a system of danger to continue expanding. It only needs to act as if danger must always be anticipated. This is where the legacy of Macbeth becomes larger than his identity. He is not remembered simply as a fall from power, but as an illustration of what happens when internal instability is mistaken for external reality. The legacy is not the throne lost, but the structure of thinking that made the throne feel like a temporary shelter rather than a position of stability. And that structure does not end with him. It expands. Because any system built on continuous threat recognition begins to prioritize prediction over understanding. It starts to value control over clarity. And over time, it becomes less about responding to the world and more about preemptively reshaping it to eliminate the possibility of discomfort. This is the hidden inheritance. Another memory fragment surfaces: when uncertainty is treated as an enemy, intelligence becomes surveillance directed inward and outward at the same time. Now the scale shift becomes unavoidable. What begins as one individual's psychological response becomes a model for how authority, institutions, and even cultural thinking can evolve when stability is defined as the absence of unpredictability rather than the ability to navigate it. And in that shift, something important is lost. Not power itself, but the ability to distinguish between perception and projection. Because once fear becomes the lens, every system begins to behave as if it is constantly one step away from collapse, even when nothing external has fundamentally changed. The consequence is not immediate destruction. It is long-term distortion. A gradual tightening of interpretation. A reduction of ambiguity tolerance. A transformation of uncertainty into something that must always be resolved rather than lived with. And this is where Macbeth's legacy becomes uncomfortable. He is not just a case study of ambition. He becomes a reference point for understanding how systems of control can evolve into systems of overreaction, where the effort to maintain stability becomes the very force that erodes it. The deeper implication is this: stability built on the elimination of uncertainty is inherently unstable, because it requires constant validation against a world that will never stop producing uncertainty. And this leads to a reflection that cannot be ignored. If fear-based systems always expand their own definition of threat, then they do not merely respond to reality. They gradually replace it with a version of reality that is defined by what it cannot tolerate. A memory fragment closes this layer. What a system refuses to accept eventually becomes the very thing that defines its boundaries. So what remains after Macbeth is not resolution, but continuity. A pattern that suggests power, when grounded in fear, does not end with the individual who first embodies it. It persists as a logic that can be inherited, repeated, and scaled. And that raises the final question of consequence. If fear does not simply distort decisions, but defines the framework through which decisions are made, then what part of human judgment is truly independent of the systems that shape what we are most afraid to lose? What remains at the end of this entire structure is not a story about a man who lost control, but a deeper recognition that control itself was never the foundation we believed it to be. The final insight is unsettling in its simplicity. Fear does not just influence perception. It selects what perception is allowed to survive. Once that happens, every act of judgment becomes filtered through preservation rather than truth. Not because truth is absent, but because truth becomes secondary to emotional survival. And in that shift, the human mind begins to mistake protection for clarity. A memory fragment returns like a final echo. When uncertainty is treated as danger, the mind stops exploring reality and starts negotiating with it. And that is where the legacy settles. What Macbeth leaves behind is not a lesson about ambition, but a structural warning about interpretation itself. The moment internal instability becomes externalized as worldview, the boundary between what is real and what is feared begins to dissolve. And once that boundary dissolves, every system built on perception becomes vulnerable to its own assumptions. But the human meaning goes deeper than tragedy. Because what we are really witnessing is not the fall of a ruler, but the fragility of any mind that cannot tolerate ambiguity. The need to resolve uncertainty quickly, to assign meaning too early, to convert unknowns into threats or goals, becomes the hidden force shaping decisions long before awareness enters the process. Another memory fragment surfaces here. The most powerful systems are not those that eliminate uncertainty, but those that learn to coexist with it without collapsing into reaction. This is where the reflection expands beyond the story. Because Macbeth becomes a mirror, not of ancient Scotland, but of any consciousness that confuses control with safety. Any structure, whether personal, social, or institutional, that begins to treat unpredictability as something to be erased instead of understood, inherits the same internal tension. The system may grow stronger on the outside, but it becomes more fragile on the inside. And this is the quiet legacy that remains. Not downfall. Not punishment. But a pattern of thinking that continues to repeat wherever fear is allowed to define what reality must look like in order to feel acceptable. A memory fragment lingers at the edge of this realization. What a mind refuses to accept about uncertainty will eventually return as the very structure it tries to control. So the question that remains is not about what happened to Macbeth, or even what he represents in history. It is about what continues to happen in any moment where fear becomes the first interpreter of meaning. Because if fear is shaping what we see before we even understand what we are looking at, then the deepest uncertainty is not in the world outside. It is in how quickly we turn the unknown into something we believe we already understand. And that leaves one final question suspended in silence. When perception itself is filtered through the need for safety, can we still trust that what we call understanding is truly seeing the world, or only seeing the limits of what we are afraid to lose?